Okay, so we're at 14C, relative and restrictive clauses. This will be a short little video on a symbolization topic, and then the rest of the videos for this unit are going to be problems, solving problems. So, example problems. Okay, so restrictive and relative clauses. So, in Chapter 2, we had relative clauses. And what's a relative clause? So we'd have Bob, who is tall, is happy, and the who is tall is the relative clause. And it has, why is it called a relative clause? Because it has the relative pronoun who. Relative clauses stay with us in Chapter 3, but we're going to get new who clauses. We're going to have what are called restrictive clauses. And we're also going to have other relative pronouns like which and that, or yeah, which, when, and so on. And restrictive clauses are symbolized differently than relative clauses, so you need to be able to distinguish them and understand how they're differently symbolized. Okay, so how does this work? Okay, so let's look at relative clauses. So here we have a sentence, all novelists who are lonely are also geniuses. So, so we'll start with the sentence, all novelists who are lonely are geniuses. So what does this sentence mean? Well, we couldn't mean all novelists who are lonely are also geniuses. So the who are lonely, that's a relative clause, and it tells us something about each novelist. What? Well, so the whole sentence, all novelists are geniuses, so the whole sentence tells us, among other things, that all novelists are geniuses. And then the relative clause, who are lonely, says something else. It says all novelists are lonely. So what we have, we're saying two things about novelists. For all x, if nx then gx, and for all x, if nx then lx. So the relative clause can be, in Chapter 2, we treated relative clauses as conjunctions, and here we're doing so as a conjunction. We said if a sentence has a relative clause in it, we symbolize the whole sentence as a conjunction. One conjunct is the main clause, the other conjunct we deal with the relative clause, and that's what we're doing here. So the left conjunct for all x if nx then gx, that's the main clause. And the relative clause is for all x if nx then lx, and that's where we say that all novelists are lonely, which is what the relative clause who are lonely does when it's in the sentence with all novelists. Another way we could symbolize this is just as for all x if nx then gx and lx. Okay, so those two symbolizations are equivalent. Either is perfectly acceptable. Fundamentally, we're saying two things about all of the novelists. Okay. Now let's consider a sentence with a restrictive clause. So here we have every novelist who is lonely is a genius. Okay, so what's going on here? We could say all novelists who are lonely are geniuses. So here we have a restrictive clause. So consider the sentence, all lonely novelists are geniuses. That would be for all x. If Lx and Nx, then Gx, right? We have the all lonely novelists are geniuses, so we can say the determinative phrase is all lonely novelists. The verb phrase is genius. All gives us a universal and a conditional. Lonely novelist is the noun phrase in the determinative phrase, so it goes in the antecedent. How do we say that something is a lonely novelist? We say it's a lonely and it's a novelist, so Lx and Nx. Genius is symbolized in the consequent, so Gx. Okay. So the who clause, and all lonely novelists, that's what the original sentence says. All novelists who are lonely are geniuses. That's the same thing as saying all lonely novelists are geniuses. So what the restrictive who clause does is it restricts the group that we're talking about. It restricts it from the large group novelists down to the potentially smaller group lonely novelists. So this sentence does not tell us something about all novelists. Remember, the original sentence told us two things about all novelists. It said all of them have two properties: they're lonely and they're geniuses. This sentence says nothing about all novelists. It only talks about a smaller group, lonely novelists, and says one thing about them: they're geniuses. So the relative clause, two things about all the novelists. Restrictive clause, only one tells us one thing about only some of the novelists. So the relative clause sentence is much stronger than the restrictive clause sentence because it says a lot more about a bigger group. The restrictive clause sentence says less about a smaller group. So you have to get the sense, if it's a relative clause, it's a conjunction of the whole sentence. The whole sentence is treated as a conjunction. We get two determinative phrases, or you can stick the conjunction in the consequent. So we have the group of novelists, and we say two things about them with the conjunction in the consequent. That's how you work with relative clauses. Restrictive clauses, conjunction in the antecedent. And so how do we know which one is which? Subordinate clauses, relative clauses. So if we have a subordinate clause and it's set off by a comma, then it's a relative clause. If it's then that's in the first case. All novelists, comma, who are lonely are geniuses. If we get rid of the commas, we say all novelists who are lonely are geniuses, then it's a restrictive clause. So that's what you need to know. So that's how you do relative and restrictive. So if you have questions about any of this, let me know, or I'll see you in office hours on Sunday. And do take a look at the different videos of problems being worked.